the world has legitimately gone nuts again.
More than 100 targets were hit in the Hamas-run enclave overnight.
Ground invasion is imminent, and Israeli commandos have started conducting raids to target Hamas militants.
And I should probably figure some things out. So in this video, we are going to be looking at the Israeli-Palestine war, as well as some of the history of it, to just see what's going on. As a full-time traveler, as a slow traveler, choosing the country and understanding the heart of a culture is just very, very important to me, especially if it's ever been on my list of places to potentially try out. Now that the war has been going on for 2 months with honestly just a lot happening, I think I need to take a break from regular life and dig a little deeper, because my Israel-Palestine history is not necessarily as strong as it needs to be. So we're going to dive into the region, all the things. Here we go. There is a channel called History on Maps. We've got history of Israel-Palestine conflict, Israel-Arab wars. On the thumbnail, it says 1948 to now. I saw a short that suggested that Israel has only existed since 1948. So something clearly significant happened in 1948 to give people this idea. But as a Christian, I already know 1948, disingenuous. It would be just as disingenuous to say that Palestine started in 1988. All right, let's go into history of Israel-Palestine conflict. It should be a good top view, unbiased. I say unbiased, listen, there's no such thing. There's no such thing, but there are videos that attempt to be unbiased. There are also videos that pretend to be unbiased. So it can be a minefield to navigate. Just based on the channel, it should be relatively unbiased, which is a great place to start.
Israel, the world's only Jewish state, located east of the Mediterranean Sea, and Palestine, the territory of the Arab population that hails from the Israel-controlled land, have long been known for their enduring conflict with the Israeli occupation of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip.
Pausing just to take a closer look at the map, we look at the color coding, and we notice that the West Bank, I don't know what the actual percentage is, but it looks like half, a little less than half maybe, is Israeli military control. We have the orange mixed governance, we have the red Palestinian governance, and then we've got just a couple areas that are disputed Israel governance, and then the entire Gaza Strip fully red, complete Palestine control. Coming from the US, we could argue that our map looks a little bit like this because we do have like reservations. I'm not saying they're the same as what's happening in Israel, but true maps of countries do tend to have regions of dispute, we'll say. I first learned that living in New Mexico when I was in the 8th grade, the different pockets we have throughout the US.
In the 17th centuries BC, following the call of God, 3 patriarchs of the Jewish people, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, settled in Canaan, a region approximating present-day Israel, the West Bank, and the Gaza Strip, parts of Lebanon, Syria, and Jordan. In 1000 BC, King Saul established the Israelite monarchy. After the death of King Solomon, the united monarchy was split into the Kingdom of Israel in the north, with Samaria as the capital, and the Kingdom of Judah in the south, with Jerusalem as the capital.
All right, so it looks like 931 BC, give or take, is when the word Israel became a thing. Top half Kingdom of Israel, bottom half Kingdom of Judea.
The land became home to a majority of Jews, but then it was subject to numerous conquests of various groups, leading to the significant decrease of the Jewish population on the land. One of these conquests was conducted by the Roman Empire.
So this is the first time that we're hearing of the Jewish population being kicked out, 931 BC.
The Roman Empire, who gave the name Palestine to Judah, intending to break the Jewish connection with the land of Israel.
So just the southern part was called Palestine at 63 BC. Okay.
During this time, Christianity, which started as a Jewish sect, ultimately became a dominant religion toward the end of the Roman Empire. In the 7th century came an Arab conquest, beginning the spread of Islam. The Dome of the Rock was built on the ruin of the Second Temple, making Jerusalem the holy city to 3 monotheistic religions: Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. After Christians in Jerusalem were intensely persecuted by the Seljuk Turks, a Central Asian empire with ambition to expand its territory,
Can I nitpick saying the 11th century when all the other times it's telling me the actual year? So it should be the 1000s AD. I guess that just sounds weird to say. All right, sorry.
Christians in Europe launched several crusades to bring the Holy City back to the hand of the Christians. During this time, many Jews were killed. Others were making pilgrimages everywhere, mostly in Western Europe. From the 16th century to World War I, the Holy Land, along with much of the Middle East, was ruled by the Ottoman Empire, an Islamic superpower. The land was unofficially called Palestine.
So first of all, Ottoman Empire ended in 1917. That feels very recent, doesn't it? But yeah, the conflict in this area, they're mentioning the Ottoman Empire, they're mentioning the Turkish Empire, which I believe the Turkish Empire became the Ottoman Empire. I could be wrong. They're mentioning the Romans. They're not mentioning the many other, Persian, Babylonian, but we're seeing definite sucks to be Jewish persecution at this point. Now, that being said, I don't think literally every Jewish person left the area, and I know that there was at least a short period in the Persian reign where Jewish people were actually encouraged to come back to the region. And I point that out just to show that they weren't always just kicked out. Curious. So then during the Ottoman Empire, because they're about to mention Palestine, it looks like, so maybe I should listen. Hold on.
At the same time in Europe, more and more Jews were joining a movement.
So as the Jewish are being killed off, the Palestinians, can we call them that at this point? The Arabs are maybe not being killed off during these moments, or at least not in the numbers that the Jewish people are being killed off. Is that why he's not mentioning it? Because that's an illogical assumption. Even though this video is not talking about it, from the beginning, there were non-Jewish people living in this territory as well. It was not a 100% Jewish society. When there is war, when there is disbursement, I highly doubt that it was literally just the Jewish people that were kicked out. All of these different nations and empires fighting and taking control, it had to have had a negative effect also for the Arabs. But this video is just not mentioning it.
At the same time in Europe, more and more Jews were joining a movement called Zionism, aiming to create a Jewish national state in its ancient homeland. Hence, in the first decade of the 20th century, tens of thousands of Jews moved from Europe back to the region.
Back to calling it the 20th century. Maybe it's only annoying me because I'm writing a timeline in here and I don't want to change back and forth between these different ways of expressing time.
World War I exploded and ended with the collapse of the Ottoman Empire. Its land in the Middle East was carved by the British and French empires.
International zone.
The British then gave more independence for Iraq and Jordan, and the region remaining under the control of Britain was what it called the British Mandate for Palestine, where Britain promised to establish a Jewish national homeland under its Balfour Declaration, which went into effect in 1923. Tensions between the Jews and the Arabs who both claimed the land grew.
So the Balfour Declarations came when the Jewish Zionists were already trying to return to their homeland, essentially. So is Britain's way of supporting?
Tensions between the Jews and the Arabs who both claimed the land grew, which even led to acts of violence. By the 1930s, following the increasing Jewish population in Palestine due to the fear of persecution during the Nazi reign in Germany, the British limited Jewish immigration.
So 1934, before World War II, they're really starting to evacuate Europe, coming over here, and the Britons were like, pause. We don't need that many of you here right now. We can't, stop coming back. I will say the US did a similar thing. I don't know exactly the year, but I've memorized it as during World War II. It might have been just before, but Jewish populations were trying to come to the US and we turned them away because we didn't, at that time, want to be involved in World War II. So we were like, no refugees. Nobody can come here. US history, man.
In response, the Jewish militias formed to both fight the Arabs and resist the British rule. Then came the Holocaust throughout Nazi Germany, which claimed almost 6 million Jewish lives.
We had 9.5 million Jews in Europe in 1933, 6 million of which were killed. Pretty significant difference.
After the war, more and more Jews then fled from Europe to Palestine to seek a homeland, escalating the tension with the Arabs. Overwhelmed by the situation, Britain began to withdraw from the region.
I'm literally picturing Britain being like, okay, slowly backing away. This is a lot, and we're just, okay, tiptoeing out of the room, hoping nobody notices. That's what I'm picturing.
After World War II, the UN proposed a plan to partition Palestine into two independent states, a Jewish state and an Arab state, with the city of Jerusalem becoming an international zone with a special status. However, the plan according to which the Jewish, accounting for only 1/3 of the population, was granted more territory, 56.5% of the land, was rejected by the Arabs. They began to form volunteer armies throughout Palestine.
This is looking at the population number. The population number and the amount of land that people should get aren't always correlated. What do I mean? I mean that the population density, let's say, in California is drastically different from the population density in Wyoming. If those two locations were to fight, there's already a border there, right? We wouldn't worry about the population number. We would say, hey, you're already in Wyoming, you become Wyoming, and you're already in California, you become California people. And Californians would get per person a smaller amount of land because they're much more populated than Wyoming. But does that make it fair? Okay, so my question at this point is, I get the Arab argument, but this map wasn't created out of nowhere. So my assumption would be that the map we're looking at now must be the area where the Arabs were most populous. It must be where the Arabs were mostly living, whereas the light blue must be where Jewish people were mostly living. Does that make sense? Like, this is a guess based on travel experiences, life experiences. When lands get divided, it's not necessarily like, oh, there's a lot of you here, so you're going to get more land. That's not generally how it gets divided. It often gets divided based on where people already live. I don't know that that's what happened at this point. But again, when you're talking about land division, I also understand the argument of, hey, we want more land. So I understand rejecting it for that basis as well. I looked up earlier, this is based on today, not necessarily 1947. Israel is the size of New Jersey, the entire country size of New Jersey. So Gaza Strip at 139 square miles is the size of the city of Philadelphia. I've never been there, but it's a city. And then the West Bank, the size of Delaware, the state of Delaware. I think Delaware might be our smallest state. Rhode Island is the smallest U.S. state. So Delaware is the second smallest U.S. state. I also got like the population numbers, but I don't think that's relevant right now. So this entire place is the size of New Jersey, which is already not a large location. So to divide it is a bigger deal just in terms of where your people can go.
Right after the announcement of an independent Israel, a war between the Arabs and the Jews broke out, which was known as the 1948 Arab-Israeli War.
All right, so this is where we get the 1948 Israel is an independent state. Israel didn't start in 1948. However, they were kicked out. And so this is, we'll call it maybe the new era or the modern era of Israel from 1948. I do think it's disingenuous. Again, I've seen a couple videos that suggested Palestine was here first. Right now, we're going to go with no. However, I can honestly understand both states' argument. The Jewish, I'm going to say, was there first, but constantly getting kicked out. The people that stayed, who were not getting kicked out, were what we might call today the Palestinians. Eventually, the name became Palestinian. And so I can see both arguments.
The war involved 5 recently independent Arab nations: Egypt, Jordan, Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon, the Arab League, who invaded the region in an attempt to establish a unified Arab Palestine. However, a ceasefire agreement was reached a year later in which more than 2/3 of historic Palestine, including the West Jerusalem, belonged to Israel, while Jordan occupied East Jerusalem and the area known as the West Bank, and Egypt occupied the Gaza Strip. As a result, more than 750,000 Palestinians were expelled from the land where they lived for centuries on the day that they call Al-Nakba, or the catastrophe.
I think here we're going to start to see the dispersing of Palestinians, because we saw the dispersing of Jewish people historically. Now we're going to start to see the tide turning, where Palestinians are going to be displaced. What I didn't necessarily realize is Jordan took the West Bank. Egypt took Gaza Strip. So just by the fact that they are now Jordanians and Egyptians, and I'm sure they didn't call themselves that, is itself a displacement. If the majority of Palestinians were in that region, were they displaced by Israelis or were they displaced by Egypt and Jordan? So that's my question. Or are we saying that there was 750,000 Palestinians in the Israeli, the blue section, and they were expelled from there? This is the negative of top view. There's a lot of questions come into my head. We're going to assume, for the sake of this argument, that it's probably from the Israeli controlled region that they were displaced and not the people that were already in the West Bank and Gaza Strip, because it looks like those regions are controlled by Egypt and Jordan, and I don't know necessarily their viewpoints on Palestinians per se.
With the deteriorated dispute between the Jews and the Arabs, there came more wars and fighting in the following decades.
Of course.
It was in 1967 when the 60-day war broke out after a volatile period of diplomatic friction and skirmishes between Israel and its neighboring Arab states, Jordan, Syria, and Egypt. This brief war ended with the victory of Israel, giving Israel control over the Golan Heights from Syria, the West Bank and East Jerusalem from Jordan, and Gaza and the Sinai Peninsula from Egypt. Sinai was later returned to Egypt under the Egypt-Israel Peace Treaty. After the war, most Palestinian refugees and their descendants were not allowed to return to their homes, but had to live in Gaza, the West Bank, and neighboring Jordan, Syria, and Lebanon.
I really wish I had numbers, because most people were not allowed to return. This is after the Arab-Israeli war, where Israel already won. And so I don't know what many means. This is not a tangible number. We're not allowed to return. That means that a certain percentage of the Palestinians/Arabs were allowed to stay in Israel. And I'm really curious as to why some were allowed to stay and some weren't. And then in 1967, I'm curious, again, how many more were displaced, and also, again, how many were allowed to stay. Because I don't believe, and certainly I feel like more videos would tell us if there was complete exile, a complete kicking out of Arabs. And then it doesn't mention it, but if I understand correctly, people who lived in Gaza and West Bank, they didn't lose their homes?
The rising number of Israelis settling in the Palestinian territories in the West Bank and Gaza gave rise to the PLO, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, first founded in Cairo, Egypt in 1964 to create a liberated Palestine in Israel.
Right. The Palestinian Liberation Organization, which still exists, like I know who they are, started in Egypt. Why Egypt? I'm going to assume these are still Palestinians. Lots of kicking out of Palestinians going on at this point. So maybe there's just a plethora of Palestinians in Egypt who wants to either return to the homeland or they want to preserve and protect Palestine.
The PLO launched attacks on Israel from its base in Jordan. It was then forced to move from Jordan to Lebanon, starting to carry out acts of terrorism against Israel.
Why was it forced to move from Jordan to Lebanon? It was forced to move.
Fighting went on for years, including the Israeli invasion of Lebanon to kick the PLO out of Beirut. The PLO eventually agreed to divide the land between Palestine and Israel, but there were still more and more Jewish settlers moved into the Israel-occupied Palestinian territories. In 1987, a violent Palestinian uprising was ignited.
Again, lots of details missing, but if you make an agreement that we're going to own this side and you're going to own that side, why are there people moving in? How are they moving in? Let's Google that. We've got Al Jazeera, which is definitely, we're going to say pro-Arab, pro-Palestine in their leanings. So they're not going to tell me anything nice about Jewish, but let's see what they say, because sometimes you can read a lot how people talk about their enemies, right? 1967 is the first settlement built in occupied West Bank. So again, this is Al Jazeera, but they're saying that the Israeli authorities give its settlers in the West Bank 20 million shekels a year. So combined, I'm sure, to monitor, report, and restrict Palestinian construction in Area C. And Area C is Israeli-controlled region in the West Bank. I've got so many questions from reading this article, but yeah, they're saying Israel declared that the West Bank territory is state land. And again, I think we're talking about the Area C. There's also Israeli non-governmental organizations that work to evict Palestinians from their land using loopholes in the land laws. End result, I don't know how they're being allowed to move in. Palestine is not a country, right? It's a state, but it's not a country. So unlike the US, where a foreigner can buy land, it is awkward at best. Like, just from my perspective, it seems awkward at best that Jewish people are allowed to buy land or allowed to settle in the region. At this point, we're just going to say it's questionable. I'm not finding a good resource that gives me a solid answer as to how the Jewish people are moving into West Bank. And at this time in 1987, they're also moving into Gaza. I don't know how it's legal. While I can't definitively say that it's illegal, I'm leaning that way. I'm going to bet the intent of an Israel-controlled region was not about purchasing land for individual residents, was not about allowing Jewish people to live there. It feels wrong, is my point. I'm saying it feels wrong, it sounds wrong. If you have a resource that will explain if that's allowed. So even if they're buying the land, even if somebody's selling them the land, is it allowed?
Starting from the Jabalia refugee camp after an Israeli Defense Forces truck collided with 2 Palestinian civilian vans, killing 4 of them.
It doesn't say, but we're going to assume it was on purpose.
This was known as the First Intifada. This bloody conflict, resulting in hundreds of deaths, triggered a peace process with the signing of the Oslo Accords by Israel and the PLO, the Oslo I Accord signed in Washington, D.C., and the Oslo II Accord in Taba, Egypt. According to the Oslo Accords, the West Bank was divided into 3 areas. Area A was exclusively controlled by the Palestinians. Area B was controlled by both the Palestinians and Israel. Area C was fully controlled by Israel.
He didn't verbally say it, but there's the yellow area annexed by Israel is what it says here. We saw this picture before where it said disputed land. So much gray area, right?
Though further peace talks continued in 2000, the Israelis and Palestinians could not reach agreements on issues like the status of Jerusalem, rights of refugees, and the increased Jewish settlement in Palestinian lands. Ariel Sharon, a Jewish Israeli who would later become Israel's prime minister, visited the Temple Mount, home to the Al-Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem. The action was deemed offensive by many Palestinians, and the Second Intifada broke out.
Intifada is officially shaking off in Arabic, but in Palestine it means a civil uprising, right? So this is the second civil uprising. This is Wikipedia. The Second Intifada. Okay, so they're saying the stated purpose for Sharon's visit of the compound was to assert the right of all Israelis to visit the Temple Mount. However, according to Likud, and Likud is one of the political parties in Israel, and I believe it's considered far right, the actual purpose was to show that under a Likud government, the Temple Mount will remain under Israeli sovereignty. The Temple Mount, by the way, is from a religious perspective. It's the holiest site in Judaism, and it's where the first and second holy temples, which were destroyed, once stood. The area served as the spiritual center of the Jewish people for centuries. Muslims' interpretation of the Quran agree that the mount is the site of the temple originally built by Solomon. Again, so the 2 temples we're talking about. The Prophet Muhammad, founder of Islam, is believed to have ascended into heaven from the site. So this one location is very important for both religions. On the one hand, we've got Sharon just visiting, like, as a Jewish person, they want to visit this location, right? They want rights to this location. And Muslims also have a right to the location. And so it's a matter of, are you going to let him? It's physically, Jerusalem is physically in the West Bank. The Mount is physically in the West Bank. This is why Jerusalem is almost always considered an international area, because internationally, the world recognizes Israel and Palestine will never let go of this location. Like, they might let go of a lot of things, but they're never going to let go of Jerusalem because there's so much religious significance there. It's a cloudy day, so the sun keeps coming and going during this video. Let's get back to the video.
The violence ended with Israel's withdrawal from Gaza, but continued to settle in the West Bank.
All right, so 2005, the time period where there are no Jewish people in Gaza. Gaza is a 100% Palestinian-controlled area. So less than 20 years, the Gaza Strip has been completely controlled by Palestinians. Now, I say completely controlled, I just mean within the borders of Gaza, it's Palestinian. Israelis, they built this blockade, ultimately to protect themselves from the crazy amount of attacks happening in Gaza, and comparatively the West Bank is much more peaceful. Why is it much more peaceful? We don't know yet.
Israel conflict with Hamas.
Oh, there it is. There is the reason why it's more peaceful. Hamas.
Hamas is a Sunni Islamist militant group aiming to destroy the state of Israel and create an Islamic state.
Okay, Sunni, Wikipedia says, the word Sunni Islamic is the largest branch of Islam, followed by 85 to 90% of the world's Muslims. It's the largest denomination in the world.
After the armed conflict between Hamas and Fatah, who managed the PLO, Hamas split from the Palestinian Authority and gained power in the Gaza. Israel put Gaza under a suffocating blockade, leading to several bloody wars between the two groups in the Gaza Strip.
So they're going over this concept really quickly. Fatah is the PLO. Fatah is the military branch. I'm probably not saying that perfectly correctly, but they are the physical arm of the PLO. So this is a civil war, essentially. The two Palestinian groups fighting each other, not fans of each other, right?
Including Operation Cast Lead, Operation Pillar of Defense, and Operation Protective Edge.
Okay, so 2007 is the start of what they're calling the suffocate blockade. A lot of people call it an open-air prison. Israel recognized that Hamas was dangerous and wanted to keep them enclosed, and Hamas took over Gaza. And I feel like an argument can be made that we're even talking about 3 different states. I keep hearing 2-state solution. I just find it unique. At this moment in time, there are 3 states in the region, because Hamas is not in charge of Palestinians. Hamas is in charge of Gaza Strip.
In 2014, Hamas and Fatah reached agreement to form a national unity government.
Hamas is still in charge of Gaza Strip. PLO is still in charge of the West Bank. It's still 3 states.
In 2018, the U.S. Embassy was relocated from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem.
I remember this a little bit because this was President Trump, 2018, who was, I don't know if he came up with the idea, but he supported the idea of moving to Jerusalem,
which was deemed by the Palestinians as a signal of American support for Jerusalem as Israel's capital.
Palestinians did not perceive it incorrectly. It was 100% to show the world where our loyalties lie. It's not the first time that the U.S. supported Israel, but it is a more recent move to kind of show that solidarity with Israel.
Which was deemed by the Palestinians as a signal of American support for Jerusalem as Israel's capital. 2021, the conflict between Israel and Palestine was reassumed by a series of hostile events in East Jerusalem, leading to several acts of violence until a ceasefire deal brokered by Egypt, Qatar, and the United Nations came into effect on May 21st. Peaceful though it may seem now, the complex and long-lasting territorial dispute between 2 states is a ticking time bomb that can explode any time.
This video was made 2 years ago. No truer words. It is a ticking time bomb. Obviously, I covered a lot of tangents because that's how my brain works. I can't just sit here and watch a quick video and pretend that I believe everything in the video. I have to look up more information, look up definitions, think about it. I do think from an American perspective, we focus on a religious aspect, which is fair, but we're talking about a land war. We're talking about property rights. We're talking about human rights, the right to live in the home that you feel is yours. And we're probably also talking about revenge. But also, just looking at where Israel is located, they are kind of the bridge, the physical bridge between all of Africa and all of Europe and Asia, the land bridge between those. Part of the reason why all of the empires, right, Babylonian, Persian, etc., why they all cared about this very specific region is because if your goal is to rule literally the entire land, then Europe, Asia, and Africa, it's one massive land that has this tiny bridge currently known as Israel. The Israeli population as well as the Palestinian population is also increasing rapidly. Fertility rate of Palestine is 3.57. Fertility rate of Israel, 2.9. If we compare that to, let's say, the US at 1.64. If it's less than 2, it's dying. And if it's greater than 2, it is increasing, right? So the US, we are overall declining. There are many arguments that the reason why the US population is overall increasing is not because we're having children, it is because we're having people move into the US. 2.9 for Israel, it's a strong increase. 3.57, really strong increase for Palestine. They're in a region the size of New Jersey. I don't know. For me, the math says this conflict unlikely to deteriorate anytime soon. Okay, so that's some of the history. That's a highlight or an overview of the history. So I want to do a quick contrast video just to show the other side a little more. Again, I do think History on Maps was a relatively unbiased video. I'm going to show you an example of a biased video and how they interpret things. Okay, so this video is from TRT World, which is an Arabic media company. So they have a strong pro-Palestine opinion, basically. So let's see what they have to say.
Palestine went from this to this, and it didn't happen overnight. Up until the early 1900s, Palestine was part of the Ottoman Empire.
All right, up until implies there was nothing before. So they're starting their history from the 1500s, which is when the Ottoman Empire started to come. 1500 AD. Whereas, again, if we go back further, we can see that there's a lot more going on. Starting with the Ottoman Empire, much more recent history.
A religiously diverse land where Muslims, Christians, and Jews lived alongside each other. Then, things begin to change, with the start of the Zionist movement in Europe calling for the establishment of an independent Jewish state, ideally in Palestine. The first wave of European Jews start to immigrate.
They're calling them European Jews as if they've always been in Europe. Not entirely true. Now, the Ottoman Empire did rule for centuries, which does mean by this time, a lot of the Jewish people had maybe never set foot in this region. So I wouldn't say it's entirely wrong to say that they are European Jews. If we were to watch a pro-Jewish video, I think it would be a much more graphic video. I think they would definitely be going over why the Zionist movement was so necessary, right? Like why they were running for their lives. Whereas this one is like, they decided, why not Palestine? Kind of the vibe we've got here.
By the end of World War I, the Ottoman Empire collapses and Palestine is under British rule. It's 1917. Britain declares its support for a Jewish homeland in Palestine. The number of Jewish settlers grow, fueling tensions between the Arabs and the Jews. The violence between the two sides caused Britain to bow out and let the UN take over.
Again, Britain sneaking out. Never mind us, we're not here.
The UN approves of a plan to split Palestine into two states, Jewish Israel, Arab Palestine. The city of Jerusalem, which is sacred to Muslims, Christians, and Jews, is now a UN-controlled international zone. Jews accept the UN partition plan and declare independence as the State of Israel. But neighboring Arab countries object to the land takeover. This marks the beginning of the First Arab-Israeli War. Israel is victorious and makes a grab for the land intended for the Palestinian state under the UN. The land gets divided into three parts. Jordan occupies the West Bank and East Jerusalem, Egypt occupies Gaza, and the State of Israel takes 78% of historic Palestine, including West Jerusalem.
So I like this visual. Again, videos can be great for visuals. So we saw a second ago, let's see if I can, right here. Okay, so what I like about this visual, because it's got more detail. In the first video, it implied, or at least to me it implied, that Jordan took over the West Bank, which is true, and Egypt took over the Gaza Strip. But now we're doing a layover between what territories Jordan and Egypt took over versus what the UN initially proposed. The UN proposed a much larger area for Palestine. Remember, we talked about how land borders are made for a reason, right? There's probably an occupation happening in these regions. So earlier I was saying 750,000 Palestinians got displaced, and I was confused as to whether this is something Jordan did, this is something Egypt did, or Israel. So now as I'm looking at this picture, I'm thinking, okay, maybe this green area, the difference between what the other two countries took over versus what Israel took over, that's probably where the 750,000 Palestinians came from that got exiled, pushed out, etc. Much clearer picture, right? Even though this is a biased video, it's still showing you relevant information. Anyway,
700,000 Palestinians become refugees as a result, and the day is remembered as al-Nakba, the catastrophe.
So this one has 700,000, the other one says 750,000. It can be hard to know specific numbers. Obviously, we're definitely rounding, so.
It's 1967. The Six-Day War breaks out between Israel and neighboring Arab countries, and by the end of it, the map looks something like this. Palestine is now fully occupied by Israel. Despite the absence of a formal peace treaty, things start simmering down. Then Israelis start settling into Gaza and the West Bank, resulting in an Israeli-Palestinian struggle that gives rise to the PLO, the Palestinian Liberation Organization. Their main goal? To liberate Palestine from Israel by any means necessary.
I love that they're mentioning by any means necessary, which is fairly extreme. Likewise, right? Israel feels very strong about their right to this region as well. And I think they also have a by any means necessary attitude. Again, conjecture on my part.
Fighting goes on for years. The PLO eventually accepts dividing the land between Palestine and Israel, but the conflict doesn't end there. More settlers make their way into Israeli-occupied Palestinian territories. The international community considers this illegal. The frustration of the Palestinians leads to an intifada. As a result, Hamas is born, a political movement determined to fight against Israeli occupation of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. The United States, Israel, and the PLO signed the Oslo Agreement to split the West Bank into 3 sections. Area A, under full Palestinian control. Area B, under joint Palestinian-Israeli control. And Area C, under full Israeli control. But the solution?
Hold on. Okay, this is different than what the first video said. So we knew that Israelis settled into Gaza before they got kicked out essentially by Hamas. We know that. I did not know that the Gaza Strip was ever fully under Israeli control. And at least in this picture, we're not seeing any Palestinian control, no joint control, no full Palestinian control in Gaza Strip. So that must have made the Gaza Strip even more contentious. Is that the word I'm looking for? A fully angry situation. Doesn't this make sense then that an entity like Hamas, who is much more militant than the PLO seems to be, would come and control essentially the Gaza Strip, right? Whereas the West Bank has a blend, if you will, right? A blend where some parts one, some parts another, some parts both. So they have regions where there's handshaking happening, regions where they force themselves to listen to the other side. That's not happening in Gaza. Okay, as I'm editing this video, I wanted to mention that I cannot find any source on the internet that Israel ever fully occupied Gaza. I do see evidence that Israel had settlers in Gaza. Both videos mentioned this, but never that Gaza was controlled by Palestine. If we look at the map that the first video provided, it shows that Palestine has always controlled Gaza. So this is a pretty drastic difference between the two videos. So I'll say this, especially because I can't find any evidence from other sources that Gaza was ever fully controlled by Israel. Here's a potential interpretation. Even today, as we're going through, are we calling it the Israeli-Hamas war? As we're going through this war, people are constantly talking about how Israel controls Gaza. In technicality, Israel is blockading Gaza. It controls the borders of Gaza. Gaza proper, inside Gaza, is controlled by Hamas. Even before the 2007 blockade, the fact that Gaza is physically so far away from West Bank naturally isolates it. An argument for feeling like they're surrounded by Israel, like they're not with the PLO, like they are a separate entity. As I look into this history more and more, it does make sense that Gazans would have a different culture, different lifestyle, different way of perceiving their relationship with not only Israel, but with the PLO/West Bank. So the second video may be disingenuous in terms of that's not what the Oslo Accords ever promised, but maybe the interpretation of what was happening is still valid. I hope that makes sense. I almost wasn't going to watch this video because I thought, it's just going to be yay Palestine. But I think, again, it's painting a picture. It's painting a picture where we can understand some of what's happening.
Area C contains the majority of West Bank's agricultural land, water, and minerals. Palestinians have limited access to these.
I'm really curious about the limited access and what that means. These are life requirements. Limited access, so many questions. Mexico is my most recent foreign place that I've lived. In the southern part of Mexico, we had limitations of water, we had limitations of things, and sometimes they're natural limitations, meaning they went through a drought, and so water is limited during a drought, but there's also control limitations that happened at least in Chiapas region, and specifically San Cristobal de las Casas, which is where I lived.
Many people said the water started disappearing when the Coca-Cola bottling plant began operations decades earlier.
So hearing those stories and trying to understand what they mean by limited water and minerals, so many questions, so many questions.
Palestinians lose hope, resulting in the Second Intifada, and Israel begins building walls and setting checkpoints to control Palestinian movement.
And the Second Intifada, that's where Sharon, was that his name, visited the Temple Mount in Jerusalem and everyone got offended, right? That's the Second Intifada.
It's 2005. Israel withdraws from Gaza but continues settlements in the West Bank. Hamas gains power in Gaza and splits from the Palestinian Authority, seeing it as being too secular. The West Bank and Gaza are now under separate leadership. Israel imposes a blockade restricting any form of movement by land, air, or sea. It's 2017. And this is the current situation of Palestine.
In this video, they're not discussing any of the violence happening near Gaza Strip or what that violence was like. They're just talking about the end result, which is that Israel built the walls and started really controlling the movement of everyone in the Gaza Strip. So
there are solutions on the table, but will we see them implemented in our lifetime?
The sun is quickly going down, so that's where we're going to end this video. In the next video, we'll be keeping all of this history in mind as we go into more current events.
And we need to keep fighting on behalf of all the hostages. Every single one has to come home.
Sexual violence was actually part of the atrocities, of the terrible atrocities performed by Hamas on October 7th.